Hello and welcome to My Security TV. My name's Chris Cubbage and this is our Tech and Sec Weekly, our Friday morning episode. Today we're going to be celebrating 25 years with WatchGuard and obviously having a look at the APAC threat landscape as well with the business that WatchGuard is in. So we're going to be looking at how the industry has evolved and a look to the future. And we're going to be joined by Nachreiner, the Chief Security Officer. He's there in Seattle. And also Vincent Tan in Singapore, Regional Sales Director for Southeast Asia with WatchGuard. So it's a pleasure to have WatchGuard with us today. So I'm going to bring on Nachreiner, the Chief Security Officer based in Seattle, and also Vincent Tan, Regional Sales Director, SCA, celebrating 25 years with WatchGuard. Corey and Vincent, thanks very much for joining us.
Good day, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. And Vincent.
Thank you for having us.
In
Thank
Singapore.
You for having us, please.
Well, look, firstly, happy birthday to WatchGuard. It's quite an achievement, 25 years. And Eddie, you can have a T-shirt, mate. So people, at least someone wants a T-shirt. Maybe, Corey, let's start with you. You've been with the business for 22 years. Yeah. So that's also quite an achievement, and you're the Chief Security Officer. So maybe for the audience, introduce yourself in terms of the CSO role and then also WatchGuard, and then we'll get into a full discussion on ransomware and a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to be talking about.
Sure, yes, absolutely, yeah. So I'm Corey, CSO of WatchGuard. As you mentioned, I'm an anomaly in the tech industry, right? 22 years at one place, but I've had about 11 titles there. Okay, I started first level support. I was a little gray hat hacker kind of kid back then when I started, but I went through all kinds of roles from product management to director of research and security strategy. And now to my CSO role, which includes heading up, the security of our corporation. Just another note, though, before my CSO role, I was the CTO. And I still carry all those duties. And in that role, I lead up the WatchGuard Threat Lab. So it's a team of security researchers. We keep our thumb on the pulse of the internet underground to see what the threat actors are doing and keep our customers in the world at large appraised of that. So I've been with the company a long time. If you haven't heard of WatchGuard, we're a company that caters to providing enterprise-grade security to mid-market companies around the world, have a global presence. And what I mean by enterprise security, we started 25 years ago as a network security company. Yep. It was really our pedigree, firewall and VPN, the first hardware-based firewall at the time. Since then, though, we have really evolved. Now our network security is this multi-security appliance, has all kinds of different layers. They call it next generation firewall or UTM. But over the past 5 years, the other part of my CTO role has been M&A. So we've acquired a lot of other companies in that time. We now have a full endpoint suite from acquiring Panda, identity protection with MFA, acquired a company called DataBlink and offer AuthPoint. So now we really cover the three pillars of security technology: endpoint, identity, and network, and offer that to mid-market organizations.
Well, I suppose that's how it's a good description of how the industry has sort of transpired over 25 years. As you say, you sort of build out the stack, and as the technology and the infrastructure is also getting built and enterprise adapts to that, it's as your clients adapt, obviously you have to adapt with what their requirements are as well, right?
Absolutely. And I would even say as the threats adapted.
Yeah.
We could talk about the history, but at the beginning, just having a firewall and blocking certain open ports prevented a lot of attacks. But then the attacks started happening through the ports you have to allow, web and email. No matter what kind of organization you are, you allow that. And that started requiring the need for all these additional layers of inspection for web and email, whether it be IPS, malware detection. So I would really say you're right. It's the evolution of both technology, how the internet's evolved, how we've gone from on-perimeter organizations to hybrid cloud organizations, combined though with the threat landscape, how the bad guys have been changing their attacks over the years, what they concentrate on, that has really developed, the security market, having to have all these different layers of security at different points in the organization.
Yeah. It's been quite a wild ride, but the story doesn't seem to be improving. Vincent, there in Singapore, maybe give us an overview of WatchGuard in Southeast Asia. Obviously, I'm in Sydney, but you have a presence here in Australia, but you're the regional sales director. How does WatchGuard sort of look at Southeast Asia and your footprint, I suppose, is a better word.
Yes, hi. We have, as Corey mentioned, we have been in the security business for the last, 25 years, and we have been very focused in the security arena, right? Traditionally, start out from offering the unified threat management solutions, and we have moved on to today, where we look at zero-day vulnerabilities and how we can prevent such attacks from coming into the network, as well as remote sites. And in Southeast Asia, where traditionally a lot of folks are very much, I believe it's everywhere in the world, very much concerned about security. People are stepping up to beef up the perimeter defense, as well as the internal and endpoint defense.
But you're in Singapore. Have you got offices elsewhere, or Singapore's your head HQ?
Yes, Singapore is the HQ for Southeast Asia. We have presence basically almost around in Southeast Asia with our extended partners and distributors in this region. We have got folks in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and the rest of the other regions are represented by distributors as well as resellers here.
So you do mainly go through the channel, right? That's WatchGuard is. Are you 100% channel?
Absolutely. That is
Yes,
so
we are.
correct.
Yeah.
We're 100% channel, and I'd say right now our focus is even on MSPs. So
Right.
a type of channel that does managed services, managed service providers. And when I say MSPs, I do also include the ones with the second S, the managed security service providers who focus more on security. So definitely 100% channel, and we focus on them because we think our products combine very well to allow them to add additional services like managed detection response. And of course, our headquarters in Southeast Asia, Singapore, but in the APAC region, we also have a Japan office. We have in Sydney, a small office in Sydney as well, plus sales folks all over the place, including Melbourne and so forth.
Yeah. Very good. Well, look, let's. You mentioned managed service providers, and we're going to talk about the Kaseya attack as well. But Corey, maybe your general observations on ransomware, and we almost went down a rabbit hole before our sort of pre-interview discussion of the amount of attacks. You can't keep up. Just yesterday, we reported on a cybersecurity insurer, Tokyo Marine Insurance Singapore, just got attacked as well. And the ransomware gangs are saying, well, we're going to go after the cybersecurity insurers because we know we just target their clients because they're the ones who are going to be paying. General observations on ransomware and your analogies of big game and living off the land. So, we'll get into the full discussion.
Yeah, no, I would say ransomware is the payload of choice right now. There's all kinds of different types of threat vectors and attacks. But when bad guys get in, when at least cyber criminals, maybe not the nation state attacker, but when cyber criminals get in, they want to monetize. The best way to do that is ransomware. And you gave an excellent local example of ransomware that just hit. I'll give you, it's not in your guys' region, but just about 3 hours ago, news from Brazil. Lojas Renner, which is a big retail outlet in the Brazil area, men and women's clothing, had a big ransomware incident. It's affected their entire data center, and the early signs of ransom would be pretty big. So really, the main evolution of ransomware, and we can talk about this in detail, is that it's turned to what I used to call it shotgun ransomware. Back in 2013 was when ransomware really took off. And it took off because of crypto ransomware. Ransomware is actually old. Believe it or not, there's something I could characterize as a ransomware attack that was from the 1980s. Nice. It was something called the AIDS virus. And it was a floppy disk passed virus. The attacker, by the way, who was a doctor himself, kind of an eccentric, or I would say wacko doctor, sent, and when I say sent, I'm not talking email, I'm talking snail mail, sent floppy disks to AIDS researchers around the world, which infected their computer, overwrote the bootloader, and basically said, if you would like this computer fixed, you have to send, again, snail mail, no cryptocurrency back then, X amount of dollars to a fake tech company. So it started in 1980, but it really didn't catch hold until CryptoLocker in 2013.
Yeah.
And for years after CryptoLocker, ransomware was what I call shotgun attacks. It was sent to everyone. It was spam to the world. The attackers, sent it to anyone they could. They didn't care if it was a grandma getting it or a business that was getting it, and they just asked for a meager $300. And I'm sure they only got a 1% return on everything they sent, but that still made plenty of money. But as we've gotten better at the industry at preventing ransomware, they've had to, one, up their techniques, and two, when I say they moved to big game ransomware, what I mean is they're targeting very specific companies that are big game to get high amounts of ransom. So what are the specific companies? Some examples are specific verticals that are very sensitive to the uptime of their digital data and infrastructure. Healthcare is the first one that they really started with. If I can lock up a hospital's patient records, patients get diverted. A surgeon can't operate unless I know what you're allergic to, what medicines and anesthesias I might not be able to use. So they go after healthcare, industrial control, and manufacturing. If I can lock up your digital industrial control processes, that puts that type of business at the point where they lose money by the minute. So they really look for specific verticals where locking up data really puts that business at risk and thus has a higher chance of a big ransom payout. Or, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Kaseya attack, they look for aggregators, a type of target that gets them a huge amount of victims at once. And the other part of the big game, besides going after the big target, is the ransom isn't $300. It's $70 million, $200 million, $5 million. It's a huge ransom.
It is the manner of payment when Bitcoin came on and the cryptocurrencies have come through. That was the game changer as well, right? Is as you say before, law enforcement would be following the money trail, but it's very difficult now through Bitcoin. They can do it, and they are, it's been a bit of a transition.
But it's getting harder because of crypto. So I would say there are three new factors that are really helping big game ransomware. But when CryptoLocker came out in 2013, I did say there were three factors that made it successful. The first part was the crypto ransomware. Believe it or not, there was types of ransomware before they encrypted files called locker ransomware. The locker ransomware tried to make your computer so it wouldn't boot. It would mess with the boot process. But the thing is, Windows administrators know how to get in safe mode. If you had physical access to the computer, you could usually recover the computer without paying the ransom. So that method wasn't effective at really getting people to pay until they moved to crypto ransomware, where they encrypted your files. The other thing they did in doing that was using industry-grade encryption.
Yeah.
The first crypto ransomware was kind of roll your own file encryption, which a lot of security companies were cracking as they did it. But then they started using things like AES encryption, the same industry grade encryption we use. And there's really no way to recover your file. So the first thing, encrypting files, not just trying to lock up your computer unsuccessfully. The second thing is exactly what you said, cryptocurrency. Before that, there were digital payments, things like money pack and things like that, but they were all traceable. They all required identity. You had to log on to a service. There was a way to authority to get back to them. Cryptocurrency, by the way, I do want to remind people, cryptocurrencies like BitLocker, the transactions are 100% traceable. The whole point of a public ledger, the blockchain is a public ledger, is so that everyone can publicly see every transaction and where it goes. So cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are traceable, but the identity isn't.
Yeah.
The way you get that private public key pair, a wallet on cryptocurrency, didn't necessarily have strong validation to who you were when it first came into play. Nowadays, it's a little harder to get those wallets without identifying yourself, but back then it was harder. So it gave you, as you pointed out, that level of anonymity. The third thing was a smart psychological technique. You might remember CryptoLocker also introduced this countdown screen. I've encrypted all your files. It's impossible for you to crack them. You have to pay this much in cryptocurrency so you won't find me. And if you don't do this in 72 hours, I should say, your files are gone forever. And that little psychological factor of limiting the amount of time was a motivation that got people to pay more. So as you say, those three things finally made ransomware very effective at making money for the bad guys.
Well, I think the other thing is the effectiveness of it, but then people are paying. So then that's actually fueled it, because it's a little bit different. As you say, we're talking 70 million plus ransomware demands. It's not the $300 through snail mail anymore. And I was writing about ransomware in 2005, and it was one of those things of this will become an issue. But again, I don't think I predicted it to be getting up to the multi-millions worth. But it has tripled this year. You know, we've covered off on a bunch of reports, but you know, a good one earlier in the year was Palo Alto's report. You know, definitely tripled. The payments have tripled. So that has fueled ransomware gangs to go, there's some real money in this. And now we're talking about ransomware as a service.
Yep.
What's your thoughts on the payment process, or the payment status here in Australia? That we're starting to talk about mandatory reporting of ransomware attacks. And I understand there's a little bit of discussions there in the US.
Yeah, they just started for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I'll tell you, I agree with you that people paying it is driving it, and I'll even add, I like cybersecurity insurance, but the insurer's strategy of paying as their main option has contributed, and I believe that's going to change. So right now, you can get cybersecurity extortion insurance, and as it turned out, a lot of the insurers to provide that were holding cryptocurrencies and often just paying the ransom. And I never liked that. You know, my argument, which I think is starting to come true, is they had no long-term actuaries. Yes, when a business gets into a situation where they haven't done the pre-work with the business continuity disaster recovery plan, they don't have a good way to restore their system. That's a hard choice. You know, I can sit in my ivory tower and tell you why it's bad, but it's a hard choice. So that is, I get the business reasons why they and insurers would pay for it. But the reason governments don't, negotiate with extortion is because you're just encouraging it and fueling it. And I think we're finding, you already made the point that one, they're targeting cybersecurity agent or cyber insurers to find the victims. But two, I think the insurance companies realize they're losing money to payments, and that
someone's losing money.
Yeah, and they're having. You'll notice insurers are starting to actively scan your network and start to deny insurance, or at least increasing your insurance cost without having more security controls. They weren't doing that before, and to me, that's a sign that it's costing a lot. And then your second question, I think the government, I believe strongly that I really don't want people to pay. If you can do anything but pay, I know I can't make that decision if it's a hospital and there's a patient on the table and lives are at line. That's difficult. But if we don't, the only thing that will really stop this is to make it to kill their money. If they can't monetize this, they'll move on. And as you said, Biden, we've had a number of huge attacks in the U.S., the Colonial Oil Pipeline, JPS, while it's a Brazilian company, a lot of the U.S. meat supply chain is associated with it. And we also know, you mentioned ransomware as a service is one of the modern things driving ransomware. Another thing is sanctioned states. Russia is a state, a government that seems to allow local criminals who are hackers, ransomware authors, to do their thing as long as they leave .ru victims alone. As long as it's not local, they don't seem to extradite when we know there's attackers in those areas. So because of that, governments like, Biden, our current US president, has gotten involved. They're talking about cracking down on ransomware. I'm sure they'll start to add some regulation and compliance for reporting and paying, which, I would love the industry to fix things without more regulation and compliance. But ultimately, when they don't, you do eventually need it to solve the problem.
Yeah, they've been a bit soft over the years. I've always asked or called for more legislation in that regard, because they're not going to do it unless they have to. And the only other defense you've got on that ransomware, if you're not going to pay, you can invest that money into your cybersecurity and your security posture as well. And obviously that's a decision. We've done a lot on ransomware, and it's getting it up to the board level to say, what are we going to do when we get hit, and it's not a matter of if, it's
not
a matter of when.
Yeah, when.
And having that discussion, because there's no point having it when all your files are gone. Vincent, maybe just and we're going to move on to Kaseya next, because Corey brought up Russia, and that leads us into the Revel Group and Kaseya. But your general observations there in Singapore with ransomware, discussions happening in Singapore in terms of potential legislation around ransomware payments as well. Yeah, just general observations from you.
Yeah. So currently, with the current situation right now, the pandemic situation, we're seeing a lot of people working from home, right? And they're bound to have an increase of such threats. CSA, a cybersecurity agency in Singapore, has noticed an increase of such cyber threats from 2020 to 2021. We can understand why, right? With most of us working from home, the network environment may not be as secure compared to a office environment, right, where security is addressed. So take for example, say with the home wireless network, we may not be fully equipped with all these security features, let alone connecting with our laptop. So if our endpoint devices doesn't have an security agent, then we may potentially open up to more such threats. Right?
But you are hearing that companies are paying up there, or do you find? But well, two questions. One, you're hearing about ransomware attacks in Singapore. I think you mentioned there was one yesterday. I've already mentioned one on the insurer. But they're paying. Is that what you're hearing? That's the trend that you're hearing in Southeast Asia?
So there are a lot of such incidents that's reported, and there are also a lot that's not reported, right? So those that are not reported, potentially some of those are our clients. They do pay as well. They do pay, right? But of course, yeah, I do agree with what we are discussing here, that we are just encouraging the cyber hackers if we continue to do such kind of payments. Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to Kaseya, because they didn't pay, and it went. It's always another thing. I think I raised this last week or the week before. Is you've always got to ask for a discount first. Don't ever pay that first ransom. There's always a 20% discount on the second offer. So, but yeah,
you should. But I've heard. Have you seen the interviews? Like that there is a lot of talk that you should hire a negotiator. Folks who have gone through this and help.
Yep.
I will say I've also seen underground chats that laugh at the negotiator. And when they have their site Happy Blog, where our evil posts everything, and by the way, some people pronounce it Revel. I pronounce it our evil. They are evil, so that's what I'm going to call them. But somebody has a lot of leverage. So I've also seen some interviews specifically with our evil that I think it was Recorded Future did, where they kind of laugh at negotiators and threaten to up the price if you're a little too stringent. I mean, ultimately they want to get paid. They are treating it like, while it's malicious and criminal business, a business. So I think you're right that it's worth doing that, because you could get discounts for sure. But be careful too with negotiation.
Yeah, I haven't heard that interview, but I've heard it discussed. And again, it's there's a bit of a change in the ransomware gang sort of approach as well, where they don't necessarily want to be evil, but they're being more sort of targeted and maybe even giving some of the money back.
So I have a very strong view against that, Chris. That is their PR. That is, as I would say in the US politely, BS. They are evil. You know why they don't want to target colonial pipelines? Because they are trying to avoid authorities. They don't really care. They're not the Robin Hood. Some of them say, "Oh, we're Robin Hoods. We're only targeting big companies that make too much money." Bullcrap. I've seen the videos of them doing donuts in their Lamborghinis and throwing. They don't give a crap about you. They don't give a crap about who they attack, other than if it gets them on the government's radar. The only reason they didn't like Colonial Pipeline is now countries,
they're on the radar.
States are making a big deal about it, which is going to lessen their business. So I'm not going to give them that, oh, we're nice guy hackers.
All right. Well, then that's a good one, because what's your thoughts or sort of insight into the Kaseya payment, and they obviously got the decryption key as well after a few weeks. But that was a major one. I mean, got world headlines. The US, Biden had only just gone over to Putin the month before for their talks, and just to even attack Kaseya just a few weeks after that meeting, and then they went quiet after a few weeks. So there's a
Happy Blog is now down.
Yeah, there was discussion that either the Russian government got involved and asked them to step back, or something that the US might have been able to do. So just your general insights into Kaseya, and most people on this channel will know what the Kaseya attack was. But
so I don't know how far you want to go into the actual attack, but if we're talking about the payment, I think all signs, and in fact, Kaseya obviously had a few problems with some zero-day vulnerabilities that allowed it in, but I actually feel like their response has been very good.
Yeah.
One thing I will note with all of these attacks, especially on vendors and MSPs, any vendor in the world could be susceptible to this. We learned this with non-ransomware attacks, the SolarWinds supply chain breach, where because of that, huge security companies, FireEye, Microsoft, Palo Alto Networks, also had their companies breached. And those are companies that have good security. So what I'm getting at is the biggest company in the world that does security well, has a really good security culture, can still have a vulnerability and still have this happen. And to me, I judge the companies more about how, obviously, if they do their best to stop it, that's great, but also how they react to it. Kaseya was pretty transparent as they could be at different parts of the incident handling process, and they've done pretty well. They do not seem to have paid, and they straight up blank said, we have not paid any ransom. Now, how did they get the master decryption key? REvil was asking for about $70 million in ransom, and this, by the way, affected 30 MSPs. So there's 30 different victims that equate. Each of those MSPs have tens to hundreds of customers. So think about 1,500 to 2,000 different organizations that also got infected. They were able to get the master key, not for all of REvil's attacks, but for all the victims of this particular attack. How is the big question? The only hint they kind of shared in their PR post about this is they talked about a third party they couldn't name, but they also talked about another company who has cracked ransomware in the past.
Okay.
Obviously, we could speculate. At first, before we saw their second release about it, I joked, I assumed they paid. I assumed they just paid to help their customers. But it seems very clear that they somehow got that key some other way. You mentioned governments. Cracking is something I'm not sure. I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible, but if it was government help, I feel like it must have been in intercepting command and control channels more than cracking keys. As I mentioned, one of the things they've been doing for a long time is kind of using public cryptography, private public key standards. So even the NSA should not be able to crack some of these things. Even if you throw distributing computing at it, it's a hard thing to really crack these if they've done it well. But so other than the fact that they did work with one company, third party, that is known for finding, let's call them implementation errors in the cryptography to recover keys, I do not know, and they're not saying. I do think governments could have helped, but if it was, it probably I could see it more on them, getting a command and control server and directly, through their authority and ISPs that are usually bulletproof, getting access there is one possibility.
Yeah, potentially, that interception, if there was some sort of communication of that key. Yes. We almost had the Kaseya CEO on. They were advertising with us at the time, so it was one of those opportune moments. I think their response was very professional, though, and obviously there was a lot of media hype over it, the zero-day approach, but there was some vulnerabilities there in their platform that was exploited as well.
Absolutely.
But again, I think they were very quite upfront and honest. And one thing that I talk about in sort of to the wider industry is just, crisis communication, cyber crisis communication, and making sure that the messaging is right and it's responsive. your observations on how companies are responding in this regards, because again, I thought Kaseya had a great playbook. They were obviously prepared and ready, and it could have gone really bad for them, had they not handled it correctly.
There are definitely companies out there that have a bad communication playbook. So I agree, Kaseya did it well. And to me, it's about transparency to protect your affected customers and partners. But it's not full transparency, because there are things during the initial investigation when you're attacked. There are pieces of data you should hold back. Like if you work with the government, if you bring the authorities in, as most companies would, in the US, you would use IC3 to bring in the FBI, or you would go to CISA, the Computer Infrastructure and Security Agency, and you would bring them in. You don't want to tip your hand to the attackers. So it's not like you should share everything right away, because there's some cases where you want to keep the threats there so that you have some information you can track. But at some point, the things you need to be transparent with is how to protect your customers, things transparently you're doing to help them. When you do learn root cause, sharing that transparency apparently once it's fixed and is great. And for instance, I call these zero-day vulnerabilities, as you probably know, the Dutch Dutch Institute of Vulnerability Disclosure, DIVD. These were 0-day and they weren't patched, but they were known. DIVD had found basically the main root compromise that allowed its pre-authenticated vulnerability, and had reported it to Kaseya in April, along with 8 or 9 other issues. And Kaseya was working on fixing them. And all of that, as soon as it was safe to share that, Kaseya did. So I think they ran a good playbook. I think they took care of their customers as well as they did. And ultimately, the big happy ending on this was the recovery of the key, because they now can freely give that to every affected victim. And that does not happen every time. So that was a big victory.
We've just lost Vincent there, but I'm sure he's all okay, and Singapore's safe. The other aspect I wanted to cover off was the other supply chain attacks. So in this response, and Kaseya is a good case study, and obviously there's going to be a lot more sort of talked about and told about once the full picture comes out. But we look back at, say, the SolarWinds attack and the other supply chain attacks, and this was not initially thought about as, well, it was initially claimed as a supply chain attack, but then it turned out maybe it wasn't.
I call it a supply chain attack. So let me define this. First, I call this a digital supply chain attack. Supply chain is actually a very generic term that sometimes some people talk about a physical supply chain when you're delivering a product in manufacturing. By the way, there's cyber attacks on those too. There's been infected devices coming from manufacturers before. But when I say a digital supply chain attack, what I mean is no organization or business in this technology world is an island. We all require goods and services from other partners. And, so one vendor we pick to do our IT monitoring is SolarWinds. And if we use that product, we can do everything right for our own organization security. But if there's an issue in that product, there's a chance it brings in a vulnerability. We can have partners. I don't know how much folks in the Asian region paid attention to the Target attack. But the Target attack all started with the HVAC, a heating and ventilation air conditioning vendor. And so even your partners, your services that you allow into your building, you give them elevated privilege. You either connect them to software for them to bill with you. You give them elevated privilege in your network. And by allowing them allowing people, software, or partners that elevated privilege, you're now at risk for anything they could help bring in too. So while some people think of supply chain attacks as only attacks that have gotten into a business and infected source code, which is, say, the SolarWinds example we could get into, I believe Kaseya is a creator of a tool for MSPs that is part of the MSP supply chain. For those that don't know, Kaseya VSA is something called a RMM, a remote management and monitoring system. It helps the MSP centralize the management and monitoring of all kinds of different products into this one kind of single pane of glass. And because all MSPs use that, the vendors that provide that become a supply chain in the MSPs. And guess what? The MSP is the supply chain into the tens to hundreds of customers they serve. So I kind of extend the digital supply chain attack to all these technological partnerships we have with outside companies.
It is as you say, it's understanding your own supply chain, but the ransomware gangs are pretty clever in their approach as well, aren't they? In terms of, I'm just going to bring Vincent back. He's joining us again. Thanks, Vincent. Everything okay there? Good.
Yep.
Good. I'll just sort this. Hang on. I've lost my screen. It's going all over the place. Here we go. Back to where we were. Yeah, they're being pretty clever and strategic in their approach, aren't they? I mean, when you look at a supply chain, you mentioned Colonial Pipeline, the JBS, and a bunch of others. The insurers are a good example as well. It's almost like they're doing some brainstorming and have a very clear strategy.
Very much so, because we're talking about Kaseya as an MSP attack, but these MSP attacks are not new. So by the way, there's some other supply chain attacks we could cover that may not be ransomware based, but do know all through 2019, ransomware, they had figured out the MSP, the managed service provider supply chain. And all through 2019, there was many MSP attacks that got ransomware onto customers. So for us in the US, it started in October 2018 when the DHS and FBI via US CERT actually posted an alert, hey guys, we see threat actors targeting and attacking MSPs. So we saw signs of them doing that. In February of 2019, well before Kaseya, there is a ConnectWise plugin. So ConnectWise is another company like Kaseya that makes MSP tools. Yep. They had a plugin that, ironically, by the way, worked with Kaseya VSA that had a vulnerability. In this case, it was actually a year-old vulnerability. So this speaks to, by the way, MSPs ought to be patching. But the vulnerability allowed people into the management system. And again, once you're in the management system, you don't need to use your own malware or tools to spread things. It's literally a central management system to go to run commands on remote agents. Yep. You can you install it through legit communications. So that affected around 5 MSPs and all their customers. In June of 2019, there was 3 MSPs that were targeted in ransomware attacks. This time there was no 0-day, no product flaw, but they just found they somehow gained credentials and the MSPs weren't using MFA. And they were able to log in as an MSP employee to a web root management system. No fault of web root, just a privileged credential. And web root allows you to exit first. It allowed the attackers to turn off some of web root's protections, and then they could just run commands directly on systems. And by the way, I talk about living off the land attacks. Traditional ransomware and malware in general typically has a file associated and leaves footprints on your computer, as you well know, Chris. They'll install a malicious file, they'll change a registry entry so that file always starts. It's useful to do this for the attacker because it establishes persistence. Nowadays, what a living off the land attack means is they're not installing a file for ransomware. They're using tools that come with our operating system, legitimate tools, to use the power of those tools to install malware directly into memory. So for instance, in WebRoot's case and in Kaseya's case, what happened is, in Kaseya's case specifically, once you get into the Kaseya VSA, you can directly run Windows command line commands on all the agents. There's basically a command they run that launched PowerShell. It launched PowerShell in a way to turn off a lot of security policies. PowerShell is a very legitimate program. Good guys love it because we can script it to automate our network. But bad guys love it because there's nothing I can't do on your network if I have PowerShell with a local system privilege, or even better, domain controller privilege. And that's what you get when you get into a remote management system. So they used PowerShell to launch CertUtil. CertUtil is another legitimate Windows program, actually used to manage digital certificates. But it has a number of uses that hackers like. One thing CertUtil can do is go to a URL or URLi and download something. So hey, if I'm an attacker, I can use this legitimate application to go grab something I want. On top of that, if it's executable, maybe the system will have local protection to scan it. So instead, I grabbed this blob of encrypted data. Guess what? CertUtil can also decode base 64. So I can take a blob of obfuscated data and decode it. And that's how in this Kaseya attack, they took a file that was called agent.crt. They decoded it into an actual executable that they put on the computer. But guess what? That executable was not ransomware yet. Because remember, this is fileless living off the land attacks. That executable had a DLL that was actually Windows Defender, the legitimate DLL for Windows Defender. But it was like a year-old version. It was legitimate, but it was old. Why? Well, guess what? A year ago, Microsoft's Windows Defender suffered from something called DLL hijacking. It's a type of attack that allows me to take a blob of data and inject it directly into memory. So then they ran the legitimate but old Windows Defender, and they used that vulnerability to take another blob of data, not yet an executable file on the computer, just encoded data, which turned out to be a DLL directly injected only in memory, not a file living on your system. That was the ultimate ransomware. So they're very sophisticated about how all of that, by the way, why do you do living off the land attacks? All of these legitimate processes evade a lot of traditional security controls.
But it does highlight the patching requirements, doesn't it? As you say, it's an old DLL, and if they had a patch, that wouldn't have been accepted.
Well, and it shouldn't be, but they actually forced the DLL to be loaded. I would say what this highlights too is I would look into endpoint protection called EDR, endpoint detection and response. It's a more modern capability that comes with EPP. EPP is just endpoint protection software. A lot of EPP is preventative post-execution for malware. And obviously, you would love to block malware before it does anything. But the truth is, it's impossible to detect everything new. Stuff gets past that. EDR is more preventative pre-execution. EDR is post-execution. EDR knows that malware can sometimes run on your computer, so it pays more attention to processes in memory. It pays attention to the things malware does on the local system. And it pays attention to legitimate applications like PowerShell, command.exe, CertUtil, with contextual information to figure out, is this normal PowerShell that I see administrators doing, or does this have indicators of badness? So I would suggest, I mean, they forced the old DLL onto the Windows system and actually got past, in some cases, patched defenders that were up to date. So I would probably recommend folks look at EDR to catch some of those living off the land techniques.
Well, it's funny, we're hearing a lot more about EDR, certainly from the vendor community. We're getting approached a lot by the EDR. Maybe let's finish off with the sort of roadmap for WatchGuard 2 and sort of where the company is at, because it's a hard way to put it. It's a good time to be a cybersecurity company because of the attacks. There's no shortage of the threat landscape, but it's having the right tools and solutions that the clients are needing. So yeah, what holds out for WatchGuard as it moves beyond 25 years? And you know, it's a well-known brand after that long. But again, anything new or changing that you see for, say, the second half of 2021 and into 2022?
Absolutely. So let me get to the future. I won't give you exact roadmap because that's never good, but I'll give you the two big kind of industry-wide things that are happening in our strategy for them. I'll use a few analyst buzzwords, but I'll define them because there's some real industry trends that lead to this. But before I do just want to remind you, for 20 of the 25 years, we've been known as a network security company. So we have really evolved in the past 5 years through that M&A that we've been doing. So one, everything I talked about, we have security controls for. Acquiring Panda Security gives us this EPP and EDR software with 100% attestation. So we have a full endpoint suite. That endpoint suite has patch management. That endpoint suite has data, data encryption locally. It has everything you would need for the endpoint. And we have identity. One of the big kind of trends going forward, especially with remote work, is identity is the cornerstone of security, because ultimately all our security products are about letting the people we know and trust in and keeping those that we don't trust out. But that all starts with making sure you know who you know. Is Chris really who he says he is? Is this really Corey? And that starts with strong identity. So we also have multi-factor products. So I do want to mention, just the past few years, we've evolved a lot from this network security company to a full stack endpoint network identity company. But to the future, what are we doing next? Well, first, our organization's IT topology has changed greatly in the past 10 years. We all used to have these offices that were our perimeter, and everything was in the office. Our email server was there, our file servers were there, our identity Active Directory server was there. Then we started having multiple offices, which gets a little more complex because we have perimeters everywhere. But I think you all know now we have the cloud. And we all use that buzzword, the cloud, but it's more complex than that, because the cloud includes SaaS, software as a service. So this isn't stuff you control. This is just taking something like email and giving it to Microsoft. It's in their cloud, just delivered to you as a service. How do you secure that? I mean, hopefully Microsoft helps and does this, but that's delivered in a way that your security has to change. Then we have infrastructure as a service, private virtualization, where we can put our workloads and we can fully control them in our own clouds. Then we have public cloud, Amazon and Azure. All these topology changes change the way we have to secure things. And for the past 10 years, they've all been separate layers and separate stacks, when the reality is we want one policy. We don't care if you're local, we don't care if you're using something that's in Amazon, we don't care if it's something in our virtualized data center. There should be one security policy that's identity based for your users wherever they are. And then finally, you add remote work. Well, before the pandemic, remote work was already picking up. What do you do for those folks that are just laptops at airports? How do you protect them? How do you give them the exact same security capabilities as you had when you were on site in the office? And as everyone knows, the pandemic has accelerated every single one of those trends. Those trends were inevitable and were happening, but we used to have time to get there. With the pandemic, overnight, everyone moved remote. And I'm telling you what, it's not going to go back to the previous normal. Remote work is here to stay. Businesses are going to be hybrid. And at least for knowledge-based businesses where it's possible, a lot of users are going to stay home because there's some benefits to both business and them. So that topology change really changes how you secure your organization. So if your listeners haven't heard of it, the new acronym that Gartner coined is SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. And really, it combines a lot of things. It combines zero trust, having identity control everything. It combines something called zero trust network access, which is a new way to do remote work. It covers firewall as a service, which is how you deliver the same security policy and the same security capabilities to a user that's fully remote, even without a hardware firewall on premise. And it also combines another acronym, CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, which is a way to protect SaaS applications, things that are in the SaaS cloud. So SASE is really the infrastructure, the security infrastructure we're trying to drive towards, making sure whether it's between cloud firewalls, SaaS protections, remote endpoint clients, firewall as a service, all of that future is what we're trying to deliver.
It's funny.
Go ahead.
No, go the second one, second aspect.
The second acronym, which I can do much quicker, is something called XDR, Extended Detection and Response.
Yep.
And this also speaks to us as a portfolio company. For the longest time, identity, endpoint, and network were all segregated. They were separate silos. We've just talked about endpoint detection and response, which is using what you see happening real time in processes and memory on the endpoint to figure out more sophisticated threats. Well, guess what? There's interesting things the network sees that can also figure out sophisticated threats. Previously, we've had endpoint and network protection separate. XDR is about, if I can do both of those things as a vendor, I start to build indicators that are endpoint indicators, network indicators, and then you add identity to it where I can strongly match, oh, Vincent has strongly authenticated to this laptop, and I know it's him that did this process, but this other process running on his laptop is running as local system. You put all of that together in a data lake, and now you can find really sophisticated attacks that one of those silos wouldn't have been able to detect with confidence on its own. And another example of putting this is endpoint and network software can be evaded. If I have a really smart rootkit, I might be able to trick an endpoint antivirus agent into not seeing me on the endpoint, and I can trick it. But guess what? If I'm malware, I still have to have a command and control channel going back over the network. And I might be able to hide that network traffic from the endpoint itself using a rootkit, but I can't hide it from a network level because it physically has to go out. Vice versa, there's a lot of evasion techniques where you can trick network security controls and not seeing you, but the endpoint has a lot of information the network doesn't see. So extended detection and response is all about bringing all three of those pillars of security and the threat indicators they find together, because when we apply machine learning and correlation to it, we'll be able to find new, more advanced threats that we couldn't find with just one alone.
Well, it's a good way to sort of close off, because there's a number of webinars on the endpoint security. So you raised the endpoint as the key aspect. It's a lot what we're talking about as well, endpoint in cloud security as well. So it's there's no shortage of it, and that's the trouble, isn't it? It becomes so it's not complicated, but it's it's a big picture because there's so much, and it's sophisticated to a point.
I would say it's complicated, but I would say, really what WatchGuard's trying to do, and for the channel and MSPs, is simplifying it by bringing it to one unified security platform.
Yeah.
The whole point is there is no silver bullet. And as the threats evolve and as our topology, just network topology evolves, it truly does become complex. But what we can do is, rather than having to piecemeal 5, 10, 20 different solutions together, we're building this unified platform that covers all of them and shares threat intelligence with all of them to simplify it as much as we can, and to make it so it's only one pane of glass, to unify the concepts, to make it one security configuration rather than different configurations for every layer. So I think you're right that our lives, our technology lives, are getting more complicated, but you can simplify it by unifying it together rather than treating it as each separate layers.
And I think, that's the challenge that the vendors have as well, because, we hear a lot on the XDR, we hear a lot on the SASE and everything else as well. So in terms of our audience, I think just keep tuning in, and if it doesn't make sense, it will. If it makes sense, well, then good on you. But then you move on to the threat intel and the threat landscape as to what it is that you're actually fighting. And I suppose just a takeaway from the audience is a bunch of stuff on the My Security Marketplace, a bunch of on-demand webinars as well. There's a 4-week webinar series with WatchGuard, Endpoint Security. I think it starts, I can't read the dates, but it's over the next 4 weeks. So again, just head to mysecuritymarketplace.com and you'll start to see that content. And maybe one last takeaway, Corey, you mentioned an ebook. You're preparing an ebook, or there's one available?
Well, we're preparing an ebook basically on 25 years of the threat landscape, which will cover threats all the way from the love bug all the way up to the recent Kaseya attack and everything in between.
Nice.
And that's a celebration of our 25th anniversary. So we'll talk about the threats and how WatchGuard evolved with them. So that should be available very soon. And I think if I were to share a site, if you go to secplicity.org, that is kind of our thought leadership site, where it's not about product, it's more about threat landscape. And we'll be sure to publish the ebook there. And you can also find things like podcasts and videos on security as well.
Great. Well, look, we have been getting sponsored by WatchGuard on our websites as well. So it's a pleasure to have you on and speak to the CSO and also Regional Sales Director Vincent Tan there in Singapore. Thank you, Vincent. Unfortunately, when you've got someone as knowledgeable as Corey as well, it's maybe a challenge, but it's otherwise just happy to sit there and listen as well and catch up on what the boss has got to say. So Corey Nachreiner, Chief Security Officer with WatchGuard, happy birthday on 25 years and well done for 22 years of service. And Vincent Tan there in Singapore. Thank you very much, gents. Pleasure speaking to you today and a pleasure to meet you, Corey.
Cheers, you too. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.